Hi and welcome. My name is Arthur Demrich. I'm director of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian. So we're meeting today via Zoom, so a couple of quick notes. First, we encourage you to submit questions that our wonderful moderator will bring to today's featured inventor. Please submit those via the Q&A function. We are recording this program and it will appear later on Zoom, but you, the audience, will not appear visually, just so you know. And finally, if you have any technical questions, please submit those via the chat feature, and our team will try to help you. It's really my pleasure today to welcome you, our audience from across the United States and internationally, to this Innovative Lives program, and to our way of celebrating Women's History Month, namely by featuring an inventor who is making history. In recent years, historians, economists, and the policy world have really begun to give attention to what many people call the missing Einsteins, the women, minorities, and people with disabilities who invent, but who rarely get the institutional or financial support it takes to go beyond initial ideas and prototypes. Women inventors, interestingly, have been featured periodically throughout U.S. history. For example, the feminist reformer Charlotte Smith published The Woman Inventor, a kind of broadside, in 1891, and then in later years convinced the Patent Office to compile a list of some 2,300 patents that have been filed by women since the 1790s. But even with that intention, interest in women inventors faded in the early 1900s. So the engineer, scientist, and inventor Mary Engel Pennington, for example, who's featured in this week's Lemelson Center blog as around egg carton inventions, please see invention.si.edu, she had to overcome biases at universities to get an engineering degree and at the federal government to secure employment. She was ultimately issued some 5 patents in the 1910s and 20s, but really was not recognized as an inventor. And there are literally thousands of other women inventors, the majority still needing to be researched and written about, who are at risk of being lost to history. Our exhibition, Picturing Women Inventors, now in the lower level of the National Museum of American History, features some of these stories, and yet there's still far more work to be done. And the Lemelson Center works to change this situation. We aim to inspire inventiveness among the public and to use the diversity in the history of invention and innovation to connect to young people. Our goal with a program like today's is to engage, educate, and empower people to be inventive and to participate in innovation. This Innovative Lives program series showcases inventors as people, exceptional people, but still human, approachable, accessible, and worthy of emulation. And as you'll see, we can't do better at that than the program we have for you today. I'm now pleased to introduce my colleague, Monica Smith, who will moderate the panel. Monica is the Associate Director of the Lemelson Center, and she has researched and led major exhibitions at the National Museum of American History, including the current Places of Invention and the predecessor Invention at Play. She's also published widely in museum studies and in the history of technology, including articles on the history of the electric guitar, the role of place for invention and innovation, and on creativity and play.
Sorry, always the mute button gets us, doesn't it? Hi, this is Monica Smith. I'm very pleased today to have the opportunity to introduce you to a wonderful inventor, Kavita Shukla. She's the founder and CEO of the Freshglow company and the inventor of FreshPaper. What started as a middle school science project inspired by a home remedy developed into an innovation taking on the massive challenge of global food waste. Made from organic spices, FreshPaper is a compostable sheet that naturally keeps produce fresh for longer, thereby reducing food spoilage. Today, it's used by farmers and families around the globe, and the Freshglow company has partnered with some of the largest retailers in the world. Kavita holds 4 patents and is a recipient of the biennial Index Design to Improve Life Award, the world's largest prize for design. Her work has been featured by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vogue, Glamour, The Economist, and Forbes. Her story of simple beginnings, belief, and empowerment was the subject of a short film by Hollywood director Bryce Dallas Howard. Kavita has spoken about the power of simple ideas at the White House, the United Nations, the Nobel Prize Dialogues, the Global Entrepreneurship Congress, Harvard University, and MIT. She has been named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list and Time Magazine's 5 Most Innovative Women in Food. Kavita holds a BA from Harvard University. Now, before I start the interview with Kavita, let's watch a great short video which introduces her and her work, and then I will launch into a wonderful conversation with her, and I hope you will join us by asking questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
As a kid, I thought I had happened upon something incredible. It was like a moment of wonder for me. I felt like I was an explorer going on this great adventure. I never thought that these crazy experiments in my garage would lead to something. I was shocked to find out that we lose over 25% of our world's entire food supply to spoilage. I'd learned that the world's farmers were harvesting enough food to feed the planet, but we just weren't able to distribute food efficiently enough, so that over 800 million people were still going hungry every single day. It all actually started when I was in middle school and I was visiting my grandma in India. My mom warned me to be really careful about drinking the tap water. I accidentally drank almost an entire cup. But my grandma made this mixture of different spices and gave me like this murky brown spiced tea, and I ended up not getting sick. As soon as I got back home, I started to do little experiments in my garage where I was taking some of the spices and adding them to samples of dirty pond water. And then a few weeks later, they looked totally clean. They didn't have anything growing in them. One day I was grocery shopping with my mom, and I noticed that all the strawberries seemed to have some fuzz growing at the bottom. That was when I had that first aha moment where I thought, I wonder what would happen if I dipped berries in my mixture. The results were just unbelievable. And I kept trying different mixtures. I tried to think of different ways to use what I learned. And eventually I put the spices into paper, and I called it FreshPaper. That's kind of how this came about. We started with no funding. We had no experience and we had no resources, but at every step of the way, people came forward to help us because they believed in our mission. They believed in the idea that simple can be powerful. That was when we first started to think that maybe we could build a social enterprise where we could sell fresh paper to growers and farmers and retailers and consumers, and that would enable us to give it away to food banks. Even having a 1 or 2 day extension in shelf life can do tremendous things for how many people a food bank is able to feed.
So we would just open up a box here?
That's exactly right. So in a crate of this size, you could just put one on top, maybe one on the side. The spices in fresh paper are naturally antifungal and antibacterial.
Oh.
So much of making a difference is just understanding that, usually you are enough. You have everything that you need to take the first step. Sometimes being an outsider, whether you're the only woman in the room or the youngest person or the least experienced, can be a tremendous advantage because you don't really know all of the ways that things could go wrong and see how you might do it totally differently than anyone else has ever thought of before.
Wow, what a wonderful video. And I hope that this has already sparked many questions among our audience members. So if you have a chance and want to start putting some questions in the Q&A, I'll go ahead and welcome Kavita to the video here. She can come on. There she is. Welcome, Kavita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here and join this conversation.
Well, first of all, I want to start with, I was going to start with a different question, but I'm actually going to say you are local, which I think not everyone realizes to those of us who are in the DC area. So can you tell me a little bit about, why you've stayed in this area and what sort of inspired you about working in the DC area as you continued with your work?
Yeah, my family immigrated to Maryland when I was a little girl. And when we first moved here, it was such a different environment for me. And my parents, they would actually take us to DC. They would take us to all the museums, the Smithsonian museums and the zoo, because we didn't have much. And that was an incredible resource that didn't cost anything. And ever since I was like 5 years old, some of my earliest memories are walking in and seeing the huge elephant in the Natural History Museum or going to the zoo. And I think for me, that was kind of what fostered my creativity. And it was a resource for me to explore all of my different interests. So, I had really fond memories of growing up in Maryland. Also in the area where I grew up, there were a lot of farms, and it was just, it was a really interesting environment for somebody like me who was actually interested in the food system and who was interested in being able to do things to make a difference in the food system. So I went to college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's where I started my business. And as it started to grow, I couldn't think of a better place to come back than Maryland. I knew that I would have access to all of the resources and the space that I might need to grow my business. But I also just knew it was a really entrepreneurial and really diverse community to be part of. And so it's been incredible for us to grow the Freshglow company in Maryland. It's been wonderful for me personally to grow my family here, to raise my daughter here. And I can't wait to take her back to the places that inspired me and helped me become the inventor and the entrepreneur that I have grown up to be.
Well, that's so wonderful. We certainly are excited to get to welcome you to Smithsonian at some point when you can join us. So I was curious, it's a wonderful story of going back to India to visit and being with your grandmother and what she taught you. Can you talk a little bit about her role and maybe other women's roles in your life of being mentors? Since this is Women's History Month, I really like to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, my mom and my grandmother have been such big influences for me, and they really inspired me. My grandmother was really the person that kind of sparked what's become for me now this lifelong fascination with herbs and spices and botanicals, and that has really influenced all of my work. So, when I was 12 and I had this opportunity to go see my grandmother, I remember I was so excited because I really didn't get to see her a lot, but I was also really I just was really nervous too, because I remember my mom had all these things that she was worried about with me going back to India. And one of them really was that she wanted me to be careful about not drinking the tap water. And that was one of the first things I did by accident when I was there. But my grandmother, she just very calmly went in her kitchen and she came back with this mixture of spices. And my grandmother and my mom, they always had like a spice or an herbal remedy for everything. And I remember as a 12-year-old, I was kind of skeptical, but I also was really curious. And when I tried my grandmother's mixture and I didn't get sick, I'll never forget, because for me, that moment was really almost magical. I just couldn't believe that my grandmother, how with very few resources and with very little, she was able to make something that I thought was so powerful. So that was when I first started to just explore different herbs and spices. I asked my grandmother about them. Then when I came back home to Maryland, I started this like middle school science project where I was adding spices to jars of dirty pond water from my backyard, because I was trying to figure out just, how they might have worked. And then eventually I had this idea after I saw some moldy strawberries to try making a preservative for food. So, I spent most of my middle school and high school years as this weird girl, like rotting fruits and vegetables in my garage. but that led me to FreshPaper, and my grandmother inspired me. And then my mother continued to encourage that inventiveness and that innovativeness and let me do these crazy experiments. So they have just been such a big influence in my life.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So one question from the audience already is, can you say anything about what spices did or didn't work? I mean, I'm assuming it's proprietary what you have in FreshPaper, but if you could talk a little bit about some of the things you tried, that would be interesting.
Yeah, well, one of the spices that my grandmother taught me about was fenugreek. And that one is really close to my heart because that was one of the first ingredients that she taught me about. So that was one of the spices that I first started to work with. But, I think what I found incredible was that these were botanicals that had been used in Indian cooking, in many different cultures in cooking. They've been used so widely. These were herbal remedies that my grandmother had talked about. And, many people, as I've gotten to know now, their grandmothers and their mothers have shared recipes with them. But I just found it incredible that they were so powerful. And I think that is what has inspired my work ever since. It's just the power of botanicals in unexpected applications. And so I ended up applying what I learned about from my grandmother for food preservation. But, that has just continued to be something that inspires me.
Was there anything that when you were doing all this experimentation, was there anything that you found particularly surprising or something that really didn't work that you thought was a sure thing?
Yeah, well, lots of stuff didn't work. The truth actually is, I was 12 when I first had this idea, and my middle school science project, I actually thought wrongly. I think my hypothesis was that, well, the spices must have cleaned the dirty water in my stomach, so maybe I can use them to clean dirty pond water. That was my idea. And so I went in my backyard and I got jars of dirty pond water, and I think I got like kitchen sink water, and I added different mixtures of spices. So it was not very sophisticated, but that was the experiment. And, luckily my mom was okay with me doing this. So I left all these jars. I was always working on different experiments, but I left like all these jars in the garage. And I think like a month later, she actually asked me to go clean out some of my experiments. And that was when I noticed that, a couple of the jars, they didn't seem to have any like gunk growing in them. That was kind of what I observed as a 12-year-old. And that was when I had this first realization that, maybe some of these spices, they can inhibit bacterial and fungal growth. So that was kind of the accidental moment that led me to make that realization. And then, a few days later, I was at the grocery store with my mom and I saw some moldy strawberries, and I had kind of another idea to try dipping strawberries in my mixture. So that was the beginning of what eventually became FreshPaper.
So when you started out on this project later, when you're really developing it, what were some of the reactions you got from people as you would tell them about this? Were there, did you get sort of immediate like, oh, this is so fabulous, or did you get a lot of people like, oh, that'll never work, or don't try it, or that's been done? I'm curious how that worked.
Yeah, so when I actually got the patent for FreshPaper, I was 17 years old. So I was a senior in high school, and I had been really fortunate to get really great advice and mentorship because I participated in the local science fair and I got to go to the international science fair. And so I had an incredible science teacher in high school who really encouraged me and who kept telling me, I think this idea really could be something that could have an impact. And so I was so fortunate to have my science teacher believe in me. But what most people don't know is it actually was 10 years from when I got the patent for FreshPaper to when I was able to bring it to market. And a lot of that was because when I first started to share my ideas with people in the industry or with experts, I did hear a lot of feedback that, it was really simple. It probably wasn't really viable. I really started to doubt myself. I think partly I thought, well, this was so simple. I developed it as a child. It's probably not sophisticated enough for something in the food industry. And so, as I started to set out to bring my idea to market, I actually wanted to build a nonprofit. I had designed FreshPaper for people like my grandmother. My grandmother grew up without a fridge. Over 1 billion people don't have access to refrigeration. And that was my intention, was to create this really simple, low-cost technology for people that had no other option. But as I started to share my ideas, I would often hear that, I would need to raise a lot of money. I would need a lot more experience. I would need many more degrees. I would need many more people on my team. And I really started to doubt myself. I now know I've talked to many other young women who've often heard similar messages, but that actually really made me doubt myself. And I didn't take that first step to bring my idea to market until almost 10 years later. And what I did is I actually took it to my local farmers market. So that was the moment that changed everything.
One of the attendees is asking, did you study chemistry, or what did you do in college that was related to this, or was it was something completely different?
Yeah, when I got to college, I really wanted to do something with FreshPaper. I was just consumed with this idea. And I spent most of my college years trying to figure out how I could build a nonprofit to bring it to market. So actually, when it really didn't work out, and when I graduated, I really didn't have a plan. It was a really challenging time for me. I had this idea that I really believed in, and then I kind of felt like I had wasted all of my time. At that point, I felt like most of my education and my years in college trying to bring this idea to the world that just wouldn't work out. So it was a couple years after I graduated college that I really kind of felt like, I had nothing to lose, that I decided to make some FreshPaper in my kitchen. And then I took it to my farmer's market on my street. And that was, the moment that I realized that people in my own backyard could actually benefit from this idea, and I might be able to start something else, a social enterprise, to start to bring it to the world.
So what were some of the processes then you had to do, or the people that you had to gather to help you make your dream a reality?
Yeah, I think the very first thing was finding the courage to actually share my idea with the people that could actually benefit from it. So when I went to the farmers market for the first time, I put my idea in the hands of farmers, and they shared it with some of their customers. So for the first time, people actually took FreshPaper home and started to give me real feedback. And I think that was a breakthrough for me, because I had never realized that food waste was this huge challenge right in my own community in Cambridge, Massachusetts. People were struggling to feed their families fresh, healthy food. Food waste was a big part of why food could be so expensive. And so that was really eye-opening for me. Then I started to learn from food banks and from farmers, how they were really struggling to keep food fresh, and how food waste was impacting them at every step of the way from farm to fork. So, I think that was a breakthrough moment. And then from there, the community really supported me. There were people that I first met at the farmers market that spread this idea, that told their local stores about it. A local Whole Foods buyer was one of the first people that, reached out to us, and it really grew from there. So it was a movement that just started from that farmers market.
So where do you find it now? I mean, is it something that is sold primarily through like a Whole Foods, or do you still find it being used by other things like the food bank you showed in the video, or where else is this used, and where can people get it?
Yeah, now today we're really proud that FreshPaper is used by farmers and families in over 180 countries. So, we started out at our farmers market, and it really grew initially through word of mouth. The first retailer we went internationally was Whole Foods, but now it's in most major grocery stores and housewares retailers. And that has really helped us be able to scale up our production. We do everything in the United States so that we can actually provide fresh paper at a more affordable rate for food banks, for nonprofits, for organizations that are working to reduce food waste all across the globe.
Mm-hmm. So to go back a little bit to your sort of early inspirations, I mean, it sounds like you said your mom was very open to your bringing in all this dirty water, having jars around and so on. Were there other things that you played with, did, read, whatever, that helped inspire you as a kid that made you think you could be an inventor?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in nature. As I mentioned, I immigrated to the US with my family when I was very young, and we didn't have a lot, but I always, my mom would always help me spend time in nature. We'd often go on long walks in the forest. I had a lot of animals. My mom was very encouraging, and I think connecting with the natural world really inspired me. I think today my work is really inspired by nature. I'm really focused on botanicals and the power of nature. And I think that early influence really made all the difference, because it helped me just look at the world in a different way. And it really fostered that innate curiosity I had as a child.
So one of the questions from the audience is, since you were a young person who obviously had this great idea, ended up doing it, but then, as you say, kind of lost courage at a certain point, maybe, and then started up again, what advice would you give to a young person who was trying to do something like this, that they had an idea they wanted to take to market? Like, what are some things they should know, and what are some things that you would, you want to make sure they're aware of as challenges that they'll have to overcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the best advice I could share would be to just figure out how you can take the first step with your idea. I think for me, what really held me back for a long time was just the doubts that started to creep into my mind, because I was worried I would never have the experience, the resources, or the funding to be able to make my idea a reality. And I really doubted if I would ever be enough to bring my idea to the world. I really felt like I would have to find somebody else who might be able to take it to the next level. And I realized eventually that had to be me. So I think for anybody with an idea, my advice would be, see how you can take the first step with your idea, start to share it with those that could benefit from it. And it's kind of incredible how people will come together and help you take the next step. But if you can just find the courage to just take that first step and share your idea.
What about, you said you often would give it at the farmer's market and people started taking it home and sort of testing it. Like, what kind of feedback did you get early on that you had to adapt?
Yeah, I think that early feedback changed everything. I think for me, the first thing that I realized was that fresh paper was something that people could use in their own homes. All of this time I had thought of it as a technology that would have to be applied in the supply chain or that would be applied on a much bigger level. But what I realized was that people in their own homes were struggling to keep food fresh, and that a technology that was so simple and affordable and powerful that people all over the world could use it to start to reduce food waste on an individual and a family level, that could actually have a big impact on food waste. So I think that initial feedback really gave me the courage to start to think about scaling slowly and to start local, but then to think global. And I think a lot of the initial feedback I got too was just about, how to design my packaging, how to maybe make the size of the sheets or the format a little more user friendly. And that was just incredible. I'll never forget staying up all night to make FreshPaper and then running down to the farmer's market and setting up my stall on a Saturday morning. And then, over weeks, seeing people line up, that gave me such confidence that whenever I started to doubt myself, I would remember those early supporters, and they always gave me the courage to take the next step.
Great. So, since this seems to be so successful, like, why isn't it more prevalent when you see packaged produce? This is a question from the audience. Like, when you go to the store, it's so frustrating. You see this often like plastic liner. What's that about?
Yeah, we're working on it. I think it's incredible to learn about the food industry. I think it's an incredible industry because there's a lot of innovation happening, but it's also amazing how many things have been done in the same way for a long time. And I think one thing I've learned in this journey is change takes time. I often share stories of other inventors, especially with students that I mentor, and I often talk about how it took a really long time for people to adopt the umbrella, which seems like such an incredible invention, but it actually took people a really long time. There was a ton of skepticism and pushback, and I think that's what we've learned too, is that when you're doing something new and different, it's important to kind of stay the course. But what we've been really lucky is that I think the consumer support for FreshPaper is helping us really bring it into the supply chain. I think consumers have really supported us at every step. I started the company with less than $300. We haven't taken any outside funding. We've really been supported by our customers from day one. And they're the ones that have gone to retailers now and encouraged them and asked them to start using more compostable, more sustainable packaging. And we're excited that FreshPaper can be part of that solution.
That's great. So one question from the audience is, how long do these sheets of paper last? And they're totally, are they totally compostable?
Yeah, they're totally compostable. And so each sheet, when in use, it lasts for about a month. So people put like a sheet in their fruit bowl, or they put it in a refrigerator drawer, and they leave it for a month, and then they can swap out their produce. But in the packaging, the sheets last for years. So that's why they're really useful for like food banks or in environments where you don't have access to sophisticated storage.
Okay. So somebody else asked, so your product's FreshPaper, but your company's called Freshglow. So can you tell us the story behind that name?
Yeah. So, when I first started the company, well, I started at a farmer's market, and I never thought it would be a business. I think FreshPaper was just what I called it at the farmer's market, because I thought that's just what it was. It was paper that would keep food fresh. And I never imagined in a million years that we would one day, have a company that would work with retailers, that would have partnerships. And so eventually, as the brand started to grow, I had the ability to pursue other ideas and to work in other on other inventions that I'd wanted to for a long time. So the Freshglow company is the brand that we started to that's the company, and we're coming out with new innovations under that brand. So FreshPaper is one of our products now.
So can you talk a little bit about something you're working on now, or things you would like to work on for the future?
Yeah, well, that is what I love to do the most. I think I'm so grateful that after this whole journey, today I get to work on the things that excite me and that I get to pursue my curiosity. I think my 12-year-old self could have never imagined that you could have a career where you could be an inventor and pursue ideas. But I think getting to learn more about the food industry and the food supply chain has been really fascinating for me. And I think, in many ways, I feel like we need to change the entire system to make food more affordable and more accessible. So that's something I'm really excited to be working on. And a lot of what I'm working on now is figuring out more sustainable solutions to make our food system not just more sustainable, but more accessible, so that everybody can have access to fresh food. And it doesn't have to be something that can feel like a luxury.
Is there anything like a little more specific you can talk about in terms of what would be part of that sustainable system that you see is lacking that you'd like to help fix?
Yeah, I think, one of the things we talked about earlier was just packaging. I think when you walk into the grocery store, you just see plastic everywhere. And I really believe it doesn't have to be like that. There are so many incredible materials in nature. There's so many incredible materials that we've learned about that I think can replace a lot of those single-use plastics. So that's something I'm really excited about, is kind of redesigning food packaging and rethinking how food is stored and packaged and transported so that we can eliminate a lot of the single-use plastic that's in the food industry.
You definitely read the mind of one of our guests, because they asked if you had any FreshPaper products that really replace the single-use produce bags that you have in grocery stores. Is that one of the things you're thinking about?
Yeah, that's actually something that's coming out this summer. So we just came out with a new product that replaces single-use plastic wrap, which has been, one of my pet peeves. I felt like there's so many problems with single-use plastic wrap. So we were really excited. Our consumers and our supporters actually asked us for a solution, and we came out with that last year. And this year we're actually working on the produce bag. So I guess we're kindred spirits, whoever asked that question.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of people who would love to see more sustainable and compostable packaging in our stores, for sure. Can you talk a little more about this role of sort of place? I mean, you talked about how DC is a great place that you came back to in part because you felt it was an innovative place to work. Can you maybe say a little more about what it is about this place of invention?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I realized even when I was very young is that it's just such a diverse community. And I think diversity is so essential for innovators and for entrepreneurs, because that's really, for me, where my inspiration comes from. It's meeting people from all different backgrounds who can share different experiences. And I think that was the most important thing to me, was to build and grow the business in an area where we would have access to diverse talent, diverse experiences, and just be part of a community that was inventive and growing. I think it's also incredible how we have access to, all of the systems that you need to grow a business. So we're able to do a lot of our manufacturing here. We're able to use facilities in Baltimore. We have access to major airports, which is actually really useful for transportation, for being able to work with distributors internationally. I think there's so many things that growing up I kind of took for granted that now as an entrepreneur, I'm just so grateful to have it in this region that has enabled us to grow our business and to do it in a way that's sustainable and accessible.
That's wonderful. Do you feel like you have a community? Are there other young women like you, entrepreneurs, who you feel like you can particularly talk to about, the pros and cons, challenges and successes of your work?
Yeah, I think I have friends that are all across the country that are women entrepreneurs, and we kind of do have a community. But I think there are so many entrepreneurs in this region. And another thing I find really incredible is that there are a lot of amazing farms. So I actually, have gotten to know some incredible farmers too that inspire my work and help me better understand the food system. So that I think is something really unique to this region, where we have incredible cities, incredible resources, access to the world, but also a really incredible farm infrastructure.
Well, there's a question here that's kind of related to that, which is, do you have any partnerships with herbalists, botanic gardens, places like that as well that are supporting your work?
Yeah, so all of the ingredients that we use are organic, and that was really important to me because, both from my grandmother and from the work that I've done, I realized how important it was to use really high quality and fresh ingredients. So that has been one of the most exciting and difficult parts of growing FreshPaper. It has been finding and cultivating relationships with people that grow really high quality botanicals. But it's been really interesting. It's something I'm constantly working on.
Well, okay, so we have a very specific question here. If they put a sheet of FreshPaper in the refrigerator's vegetable bin, will it slow down the spoilage of my green onions or my partially used red bell peppers? If yes, it's like magic.
It should. Yeah. I mean, if you look on Amazon, it's really fun. There are lots of different examples. People love to write about different ways that they're using FreshPaper, but that is certainly a great use case. Yeah.
All right. So going back to another theme that you've had here is on mentoring. And so, obviously you had some mentoring, but also you mentor students. So can you talk more about that and sort of how you do it, who you do it with, and some of the results from it?
Yeah, I think it's been said, you can't be what you can't see. And I think for me, that was really true. I think a lot of what held me back is there weren't a lot of people that looked like me that I could look to who were entrepreneurs or inventors. And I think that's what made me feel like it was almost impossible for someone like me to be an inventor and entrepreneur. So I think that's kind of the most fulfilling part of my work, is getting to talk to other students, to talk to young people who have ideas and telling them that, you can do it. And you can start in a way that's small and simple. You don't need to raise millions of dollars. You don't need access to, the most sophisticated technology, or you don't know the most experienced team. You can start in a really small and simple way and take the next step with your idea. So I think that's the message that I try to share. And I'm always really encouraged when I hear from somebody that I've worked with who has taken the next step with their idea and started to bring it to the market.
What kind of youth organizations do you work with? This is another question. Do you mentor like Girl Scouts, 4-H? What's the groups that you tend to work with?
Yeah, so I talk to lots of students across the country. I have worked with the Lemelson organization for a while, which has been wonderful. I've spoken at a lot of their events, but usually it's students that have reached out to me that I just work with one-on-one. So, I think a lot of young inventors have connected with me individually, and I'm always happy to pay it forward. I think so many people came forward to support me, from my high school science teacher to the very first retailer, a local farm stand that took a leap of faith and stocked my product, and then mentored me on how to build a business. So that's something that I really love to do. And if there's ever anybody who has an idea and wants to share it with me, I'm always happy to take a moment and chat.
Well, that's great. What are some other like skills or habits of mind that you think are important for kids to understand about being inventive?
Yeah, I think kids are inventors naturally. They're really curious. They are always asking why. I look at my daughter and she's just always looking at the world and wondering why things are the way they are. I think they're constantly thinking of solutions for little problems. I think it's incredible to look at how children are innately curious and inventive. But I think often as we get older, sometimes you lose the confidence that your ideas can have value and that you can make an impact. So I think what I try to share with young people is just to get comfortable with the idea of failure. I think for me, I've had so much more failure than I've had things work out, even in the development of FreshPaper, even in building the business. I think there were so many times where I felt just about ready to give up, and then somebody would show up and help me take the next step. And so I think just getting comfortable with the idea of failure and understanding that it's part of the inventive process, that having things not work out is actually the only way to get to something that will work.
Yeah, that seems like a very important through line for a lot of inventors. And I mean, this can get a little contentious, but one of the issues sometimes with K-12 schools is that people feel like there's not enough time to sort of take risks and fail, right? It's about the test answer. It's about the, getting it right, being the good student. So how do you feel like you always have that kind of mindset, or was there your science teacher or someone else who helped you kind of get comfortable with that?
Yeah, I think I was really lucky. So I went to public school in Maryland, and I was really lucky to have incredible teachers, but my science teachers certainly helped me realize that, as I was doing the experiments that led to FreshPaper, most of the time it just wasn't working out. Most of the time I was tinkering around and things didn't make sense. But I think having the fortitude to just follow the why, and to figure out why things aren't working, or to be comfortable and say, well, I've learned something from this, and, maybe I'll try that. I think that is really critical. And, now as a parent, that's something I think about constantly, which is, how do I encourage my daughter to fail, to do things that will help her get comfortable with the idea that, things won't work out, but that is sometimes the only way to get to something incredible, is to go through a path that, may be full of failure and obstacles.
Yeah. So when you're talking with her or watching her grow up, like what are some things that you would love to instill in her that you think might help her, even if she doesn't become an inventor like mom, that will help her, in this 21st century challenges of all these things we're expected to do and think and understand, what is something you'd like to make sure she knows growing up?
Yeah, right now, while she's so young, the very first thing that I'm excited to instill in her is just a love of nature and of animals. I think spending time in nature, my fascination with the natural world, it's inspired me at every step. And now I think, with the internet, with social media, there's so many distractions. There's so many ways that, I often talk to young people who might have an idea and then they Google it and they think, oh, it won't go anywhere because it's been done or somebody else did it in this way. And I think, one thing that I would like to encourage her and all young people is to just have the ability to focus and to maybe find ways to kind of shut out all of that noise. So for me, it's going into nature. For her, I hope it might be something like that, but just finding ways to kind of follow your passions and not let all of the noise distract you, so that you can kind of have the space and the courage to keep pursuing what matters to you.
So is that something that you find, like if you get stuck on a problem that you're trying to figure out, do you find like a walk in nature is one way for you to unstick your thinking? Or are there other sort of techniques you use to try to shake things up a little bit?
Yeah, I always try to spend time, at least like an hour or two in nature every day, because I think that's just, how I get my best ideas. I find usually when I'm stuck, especially if I'm trying to create something, the best thing for me to do is just step away from it and go into a new environment and just, get off the computer, get away from the internet, and just go somewhere where I can be totally unplugged and immersed in a different experience. And so I think for me, nature has really inspired me. And of course, botanicals inspire so much of my work that is something that I'm really grateful for.
Well, there's of course one of the questions came up is about if you're by any chance dabbling in skincare products as well. And they also said, at the risk of being too personal, they noticed that you have beautiful skin. So they're assuming that you must use herbal botanical skincare. So have you done any work in that area?
It's very funny. I feel like all of the people that are asking questions are kindred spirits, because that is actually something that I'm working on right now. So, I've been really inspired by Ayurveda, and my grandmother and my mom have passed on so many ideas to me about the uses of incredible botanicals and skincare. So that's actually something that we're developing. That is part of where our name, the Freshglow company, comes from. So.
Well, you certainly have the fresh glow, I guess. So that's you're on the right track with the name too. It sounds like
that's very kind.
Yeah, I love it. So going back to the business side of things, another question from someone was, how do you deal with sometimes negative reactions that you might see on like Amazon or whatever it is?
Yeah, I was sharing earlier, I think, that's one of the hardest parts of being an inventor or entrepreneur, is it's such an act of vulnerability to put your idea out there. And for me, that held me back for 10 years. That fear of, well, what if people don't think this is useful? What if they think it's too simple? What if they laugh me out of the room? And then I went to the farmer's market and I had all of this encouragement, but also all of those things happened. I shared my idea with investors and people thought I was crazy or that, I would never be able to do it. I certainly felt like I was the only woman and the youngest person in the room many, many times. I started to work in an industry which was largely male dominated, with people that were much older, much more experienced than me. And I think I started to realize that, the cost of that fear was that I would never be able to do anything with my ideas. And those 10 years that I couldn't find the courage to take the next step with FreshPaper were really difficult. I had this idea I really believed in, but I also had such doubt that I was too scared. I was crippled to do anything. And now, I'm so grateful to those people at the farmers market that gave me the courage, because I see how FreshPaper is having an impact. And I hear from people every single day that tell me how this really simple invention has changed their lives, and now it's helping them and their families. So I think, that's what I would share with any inventor or any entrepreneur, is that, there will always be doubt, there will always be criticism, but you have to know why you believe in your idea, and you have to go forth, because there's so many people that could benefit from it if you can just find the courage to take that first step.
And what about your competitors? I mean, do you find either that once yours is successful, other people are jumping on the bandwagon, or are there other groups out there that claim to do something similar, or just tell us a little bit about the role of competition in all this.
Yeah, well, food waste is this massive global challenge. So I think for me, in many ways, it's really exciting to see other innovators starting to address the challenge of food waste. I think we can't have enough invention in this space. I mean, there's just so much work to be done, and the problem is so big that we need everybody to be thinking about it. But I think in terms of competitors and other products, I think I was really lucky when I was young to get the really good advice to be able to get a patent for my idea. I think that really helped, because when the time came, I was able to guide the product. I was able to build a social enterprise. So So that certainly really helped to be able to have a patent for the product. But, I think for the most part, I think a lot of those fears are what people hold people back. They certainly held me back, which is, what if somebody copies this? What if they don't like it? But I think on the flip side, when you're able to bring an idea to the world, when you're able to see how it benefits people, a lot of that other stuff, doesn't matter as much.
So can you talk a little bit, because we often get this question about the patenting process, because I think that is something that's kind of very intimidating to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And if you could just talk a little bit about what a patent does for you, the process of going through it. You have 4 of them, so clearly you've done it a few times. If you could just talk about that a little bit for our potential inventors out there.
Yeah, I recently spoke at the USPTO, and I remember for me, it was like a really emotional moment, because I remember being a little girl, and I had this idea, and I had no idea what a patent was, but I was at a science fair, and I was really lucky to get good advice where, people helped me understand that if I wanted to make sure that I was able to guide my idea, if I wanted to make sure that I could, use it as to build a social enterprise, that I could guide, how it might be used, it would be important to protect my idea. And I think that was really incredible advice to get early on. I actually was 15 years old when I went in for the interview with the patent examiner. And I remember I was so nervous, but she took me seriously, and I'll never forget, she listened to me. She's one of those people that I'll remember my entire life. She's one of those people that showed up just when I didn't know what to do, and she gave me advice, she gave me some feedback, and she helped me through the process. And when I went to speak at the USPTO about a year and a half ago, she actually they called her on the phone, and we had a conversation. And
Wonderful.
Yeah, it was really incredible. And she said, I always remembered you. And I thought, I wonder what she's going to do with this. And we both just laughed about, how strange it was for like a 15-year-old girl to have that experience, but how somebody like her just having kind of the empathy and the experience to take me seriously and to give me that chance. It changed the trajectory of my life and of my idea.
That's great. Wow. I'm imagining not everyone has that same experience with a patent examiner, no matter how wonderful they are, but it's great that she could see the potential in you. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I've been very fortunate at times to have people like that just showed up and supported me and helped me take the next step. That made all the difference.
That's great. So what is your biggest, success story is hard because FreshPaper obviously has gotten a lot of publicity, but in terms of like, what is one of your proudest moments with what you've done so far?
Yeah, I think for me, what I'm most proud of is that, I think for a long time, I dismissed FreshPaper as being something that was just too simple to ever really work. I think because I developed it as a child using really simple materials, I often thought of it as something that was just like a child's idea. And when I really doubted it, I really never thought it would go anywhere precisely because of that. But, today I think I'm really proud that its simplicity is what has made FreshPaper so powerful. And that fact that it can be used by anyone in any part of the world is what made it something that had a global reach. And so I think that's what I'm most proud of. And I hope what inspires other inventors to think more simple and to think with sort of global audience in mind.
Yeah, I think so often we talk about invention as this very sort of black box technology thing, and people don't realize that invention can be, as you say, very simple but impactful, obviously. Can you talk a little bit, like, where in the globe have you gotten like particular countries or areas that seem to really get it and are really big customers of yours? Or how do you even reach out to different cultural communities and make your argument for your product?
Yeah, a lot of our growth internationally actually was initially through word of mouth, which was incredible. So, when I was still at the farmers market, some people asked me to start selling online so that they could ship to their family and friends across the country. So I actually did, and I enabled global shipping because I just, I didn't know what that would entail. But we actually initially were selling globally even before we were in most mass US retail. So the first few markets that FreshPaper did really well in was Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Now it's reached most parts of Asia. We started to work with distributors in Africa. So it's pretty incredible. I think how an idea that is simple and accessible can spread because people were sharing it. And that is one of the things that the internet makes really accessible, is that, a farmer's market stand can go global if people are able to share it, because that's something that, 10 years ago would not have been possible for most entrepreneurs.
Do you find that there's anything about different cultures or other countries where you might need to market it a little bit differently, or what is the role of sort of culture in all this? I'm just curious if there is one, if there's something that you've found different as you've tried to expand.
Yeah, for sure. I think that has been a really interesting learning for us. So one of the things that we've done on our packaging is we've made it really graphic, because you're right, as we were expanding into other cultures and into other parts of the world, we realized we needed like a universal language to explain how to use FreshPaper. So that was something we spent almost a year on, was figuring out how to make graphics so people could understand how to use it, because the consumer behavior aspect of FreshPaper is actually the most difficult challenge. It's teaching people how to, even though it's really simple, it's really different from how people are used to storing their food. So that, I think, is the biggest challenge in any market, is teaching people how to think about storing their food a little bit differently, and how to imagine using these little sheets when they put away their groceries.
Yeah, I noticed on your website you have, obviously originally the fruits and vegetables, but then you have like a cheese version and a, breads and baking version. So did those grow out of like customer demand?
Yeah.
How did that work? And what are maybe some other things you'd love to do like that?
Yeah, exactly. So, our customers started to ask for a solution for breads and for cheeses. So that was how those products initially came about. And that actually inspires a lot of our new innovations, is, what our customers are sharing are their problems and what they're looking for.
Interesting. Well, I want to see, are there any more questions from our audience? I do have, while they're thinking, and hopefully you can ask one or two more questions. One anonymous attendee just said, "Oh my goodness, she's changing the world. Single-use plastics are one of the planet's largest environmental problems. Kudos." So I just wanted to share that with you, because I think, as you said, it seems so simple, and yet this is obviously a huge global problem. Would be lovely to think that there's lots of people trying to figure out, simple ways to solve a very complex problem. Are there other complex problems you wish you could tackle beyond, sort of the food area?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I think as I look at the world, and as I think about my daughter growing up in this earth, I think, I wish that there were ways that we could make all industries more sustainable. I think, starting to attend trade shows, that I've actually been looking now, as we talked about earlier, at the beauty industry, at the housewares industry, at the grocery industry. And I think there's so much space for innovation, for entrepreneurs and innovators to come and make those industries more sustainable. I think there's so many opportunities for us to make products that are greener and more sustainable, so that we can leave the world greener and more beautiful for our children. And that's kind of my biggest hope. And I'm also really inspired, because I see lots of entrepreneurs and inventors working in that space, and there is huge customer demand for more sustainability in all industries. But yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, sounds like it. Well, so we got a couple more questions here. One is, if there was another inventor that you could meet and talk to, who would it be and why? Great question.
Oh, that's a great question. I think when I was a little girl, my mom would tell me about Marie Curie, and she really inspired me. I think it was just incredible to think that a woman in her time could do what she did. So it would be really cool if through space and time I could have a conversation with her.
So what is your experience, or how has your experience as an immigrant, or your family is immigrants, and your continued connection, obviously, to your family heritage, influence the way you think as an inventor, and maybe shaped your approach to invention?
Yeah, I think it's influenced every aspect of my work. So I was actually born in Germany, and then my family lived in Finland and then in India before we immigrated to the United States. Okay. So when I was a little girl, my environment changed a lot. And that was also really challenging, to change schools, to change environment, to cross continents. But now I'm really grateful to have had those experiences, because I think it made me really aware and really curious about my surroundings. And from a really young age, I was really looking at how different people lived in different parts of the world. And I think that gave me sort of a global perspective, which has really inspired and influenced my work, because now, with FreshPaper, I was always thinking about how it could help people like my grandmother, people in parts of the world that were living very differently from how I was in the United States. But I think now with all of the work that I do, I'm always thinking about how to make inventions that are accessible and affordable and that could be used by anyone in any part of the world.
What are some things you remember from, I mean, how old were you when you came to the US, and what are some things you remember maybe surprising you in your
Yeah,
travels between these countries?
yeah. So I was 5 when we immigrated here, but then, you know, my family would continue to travel or go back and forth. But I think what I remember most, you know, my earliest memories were just to how I felt like everything changed almost overnight. You know, I remember my life in India, and then I remember arriving here, and it was just completely different in every way. But I think that was really hard for me as a little girl, but I think it was also really exciting and interesting. And I think I became even more curious and even more aware because I was looking at my surroundings in just complete awe. I just couldn't believe that everything could be so different. But I think that curiosity and that sense of awe has stayed with me.
You continue to travel, well, COVID notwithstanding. Do you find that travel is inspirational for your work?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, other cultures, meeting people from different backgrounds, that inspires me more than anything.
Well, so I have one more question here from an audience member. So they're curious, do you use Western medicine, or are you completely using herbal remedies? And if herbal, what advice do you have for people to figure even what to use and how and where to go for resources?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Well, you know, I recently had a child, and you know, I'm very grateful for Western medicine. I think I think it really is a blend of both, and I think I feel really grateful to have these ancient traditions, these ancient remedies that my mother and my grandmother have shared with me. But then to grow up in a world with access to you know, all of the incredible advances that science has made. So I think for me, it's constantly kind of balancing what I've learned about from my mother and my grandmother, but also bringing in some of the new knowledge that we have today, and thinking of new ways to apply ancient wisdom to solve some of our everyday problems.
Thank you for that. So are there any more questions from the audience? You know, I want to, oh yeah, so one question is your grandmother still living? And yeah.
Yeah, so my grandmother passed away, you know, before I actually even developed FreshPaper, but I know she's been part of this journey because it has been so incredible and so unlikely. So I feel she's guided me at every step.
That's wonderful. So is your family involved in your business at all, or is this totally you and your, you know, and what kind of staff do you have, I guess, for all this?
Yeah, so my husband and I actually run the business together. So we're very much a family business that way. So we're the co-founders and we run the business. But you know, we from the very beginning, we've been really fortunate to have the support of our family and friends. And in the very early days when we were making FreshPaper in the kitchen of our tiny studio apartment, it was our friends and our family that were helping us make it, package it, and label the boxes and drive them to the Whole Foods distribution center. So we're very grateful for that early support.
Oh, that's great. How many people do you have now? I mean, what does it take to do this?
Yeah, so you know, we have a good sized team here in Maryland. We have manufacturing facilities in the US. So everything we do is in the United States. And yeah, we've been really fortunate to be able to grow our manufacturing even through COVID and to continue that in the United States. So it's been really challenging. You know, the whole world's changed for all of us. And I think one of the things we never anticipated was that all of a sudden everybody would need to keep their food fresh. So it's a very challenging year and a half, almost 2 years, trying to scale up to keep up with demand. But it's something I'm really proud of our team for being able to do.
That's great. So what was the metaphor? Cheris, so one of our guests asked, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, what metaphor would you use to describe the process of invention?
Oh, that's a great question. What metaphor?
Or you can just describe it if you want, but you sort of however you feel best.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like I think it's like walking into a forest, not knowing where the path may lead, but knowing that on the when you enter that you're working towards something that, you know, is beyond what you can imagine. I think for me that's kind of what it is. It's like I had an idea of what I hope to create, but I know that I have no idea what the path will be or how I'm going to get there. But as long as you can hold on to your intention and what it is that you're trying to create, you'll figure out a way. So I don't know if that's a good metaphor.
That's great. No, I love it. I love the forest idea. Yeah. We have one more question here. When you first had the experience of using this medicinal remedy of your grandmother's, how did it taste? I want to know.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I remember I was 12 and I thought it looked like muddy water. I remember I just was, I kind of thought it was like disgusting, but also, I was 12. I thought it was kind of cool. And I just, I loved and admired my grandmother. So I would try anything that she did.
Oh, that's excellent. All right. Do we have any more questions from our audience? This is such a wonderful discussion. And, Kavita, I think it's clear that people are very eager for your products and excited about this focus on sustainability. So are there any last words of advice or wisdom you'd like to give, especially if there's, potential young inventors here in our audience?
Yeah, I think these have been such great questions, and this has been such a fun chat, really insightful questions. I would tell anybody who has an idea or something that they're working on to just remember that, you may not know where it's going to end up. You may not know how to take the next step, but if you can just find the courage to believe in your idea and to share it with somebody, who might be able to use it, I think, that can make all the difference. So just stay the course, figure out how to take the first step, and just, have faith that it will, that you'll be able to do it. You have everything that you need to just take that first step.
That's great. Well, it's wonderful that you have had, that you kept going and you kept pushing against the challenges, and you've had this wonderful support. We'll end this one last question here. If do any of the proceeds from what you do go to food banks or other charities? How do you work with those kind of groups?
Yeah, so we've been really excited to be able to scale up FreshPaper so that we can work with different types of organizations. And it really starts with us visiting the organizations and understanding what their needs are. I think what makes FreshPaper really interesting is that it's a very flexible technology. So consumers use it in their homes, but we actually make it in large scale formats for food banks, because they're often getting food on pallets. They're getting food that might be kind of closer to the end of its shelf life, but it's stored in large containers. So we create pallet liners for food banks. When we work sometimes with organizations that are doing disaster relief after there's been a natural disaster or something like that, we'll send it in bulk packages. So I think that's kind of what is interesting about FreshPaper is it's a really flexible format because it can be kind of cut and customized. But I think for us, the learning has been that we try to create a technology that can benefit people in many different parts of the world, but then we try to understand, where they're struggling with food waste. And often they surprise us. They take FreshPaper and do incredible things with it that we wouldn't even have imagined. So that is a really interesting evolution and process for us.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for answering that last question. I'm sure there are many more, but I want to be cognizant of it's got to be tiring being on for these long conversations, but it's been just wonderful to talk with you. You're a real inspiration. So thank you so much for joining us. And I think I should wrap up by saying, this is part of a series that the Lemelson Center does that I hope people will join us again next month. We're featuring Warren Shad, who's an African-American, the only African-American, or at least first, a piano manufacturer, who is an inventor and CEO of Washington D.C. based Shad pianos and keyboards. So he'll be joining us and with a talk being moderated by my colleague, Dr. Crystal Klingenberg. So I hope you will join us, sign up for that April 13th, and then we have another program in May. So please join us. If you want to learn more about Lemelson Center, please come to our website, take a look at the other activities we're doing, and please just join me in thanking again Kavita for joining us today. This was fabulous. We really enjoyed meeting you.
Thank you so much, Monica. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you joining us on a Wednesday afternoon. Bye.